at a broad level, do you think the government has the evidence to support the claims they're making when they say this is making a difference for women and girls around the world?
Well, I think at a broad level, that's exactly what we said in the report, is that they couldn't show us at a broad level.
Wake up call.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Auditor General for her important work on this subject. My questions will be directed at officials. Obviously, this report is profoundly disappointing. This government has, with great fanfare, tried to rebrand some of the efforts that actually started under the previous government related to improving the lives of women and girls around the world. But a government that was actually serious about making the lives of women and girls around the world better would be interested in bothering to measure outcomes as part of their policy indicators. That should be a pretty basic thing, that if ministers and staff in the government are actually saying this isn't just about politics, we're actually trying to make people's lives better, then they would insist on measurement and tracking of results. And unfortunately, the government has clearly not done that. After 8 years of again, lots of talking about feminism and a feminist international assistance policy, we find out that the government has loved to talk about it in a domestic context, but has not, in fact, been asking the right questions or putting in place the mechanisms to link their actions with outcomes. And to the officials, even before us today, you're saying contradictory things, as far as I understand it. You are telling us that on the one hand, you take the work of the Auditor General seriously, but on the other hand, you are asserting that the work you have done has been making a tangible impact. And the Auditor General's work says that you do not know if you are making a tangible impact because your policy indicators are not actually linked to outcomes. So how can you sustain the position, sir, that you take seriously the findings of the Auditor General while continuing to say that you know things that, in fact, based on the data, you don't know?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I agree 100% with your point that gathering the results of our activities is critically important. And for that reason, for a number of years, the department has been collecting results at the outcome level for all of our projects. At any one given time, we have 1,500 projects active across all of our development assistance spending. Each one of those projects is required to have a results framework that includes ultimate outcomes, intermediate outcomes, immediate outcomes, and a series of activities that support those outcomes. Each and every one of them do. Now, the challenge, and this is a challenge that the Auditor General has shone a light on, and it's a challenge that we've known for many years that goes well back, particularly in, you made note of the great work that we've done going back to Muskoka in maternal, newborn, and child health. We've been learning these lessons over a number of years. The difficulty that we have is rolling up results across 1,500 individual projects in a manner in which it rolls up to a corporate level reporting against a single policy.
Okay, well let me put this to the Auditor General then, because your explanation I don't think is entirely consistent with the report. The report says, yes, that you have trouble aggregating those impacts, that in various cases you didn't have data wasn't being accessed, or in some cases data wasn't available at all. But more fundamentally, the policy indicators you have identified are not outcome related. They're policy indicators, but they're not outcome indicators. So you have a problem not just with aggregating the data, but with tracking the wrong things. Can I just ask the Auditor General, am I correct in my reading of your report?
You are correct in that the 26 indicators, only 2 of them are outcome-based, and those are at the policy level. What I guess I would provide at the project level is the ones that we looked at, we saw that the project officers were doing a good job managing and monitoring and paying out when milestones were met. But I didn't see that as outcomes. Those are really just, again,
Right.
more outputs. And I acknowledge that you need both, however, right? You need
Right.
outcomes to measure medium and short term, outputs, to measure medium and short term, but you need outcomes for the long-term
Right.
objectives.
And just to demystify this for those that are watching, I mean, the difference between an output and an outcome is something like an output is how many doctors' visits were funded for women needing a particular kind of service, right? An outcome is what are the health outcomes across a population. So you can say we spent a lot of money, we facilitated a certain number of doctor visits, but if that didn't actually change the health status of people overall, then you haven't achieved your outcomes. So if you're measuring outputs and not outcomes, then you're not actually measuring whether or not you're making a difference. So just back to the officials in the time I have left. I mean, I think we've clearly established the point that you don't actually know if your policy is making a difference in terms of outcomes. That you cannot, in fact, assert that we're making a tangible impact because you're not measuring outcomes. Do you acknowledge that?
With respect, I would have to disagree.
Are you disagreeing with me or with the Auditor General?
I'm disagreeing with you, your characterization of what we're doing.
Could the Auditor General clarify? Is my characterization correct?
Well, I can only speak to the files that we looked at. So out of the 1,500 files that my colleague mentioned, we had a sample. We looked in 619 of them and pulled a representative sample from that. So I can only speak to those groups, and the ones that we looked at did not have outcomes associated.
So you're not just disagreeing with me, you're disputing.
Generous, that is your time. We'll be back to you, I'm sure.
Thank you, Chair. So we just heard from the Auditor General is essentially don't attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. The government didn't have complete information on multiple projects, but we're going to charitably assume that they didn't exclude information because it was inconvenient. They just didn't provide it because they didn't have it. So just also following up on Mr. Desjardins' testimony, Mr. McLennan, I find somewhat incredible the explanation that technology has changed as sort of a basis for saying you don't have and haven't kept proper information for measuring outcomes. Like databasing has existed as a concept for thousands of years. It's just a matter of making sure that the new technology is able to receive information from the previous technology. But if you never collected the information, if you were looking at the wrong indicators, if you're not measuring outcome-based indicators, that's not a problem of technology, surely, is it? That's a problem of a policy and administrative failure on the part of government to say we need this information, we need it stored somewhere, and we need to ensure that as we roll out new technology that we are incorporating the information from previous systems into the new systems.
So, thank you for the question. So there are two things in there that got a little jumbled up in terms of whether or not we're actually identifying the outcomes we want to achieve in our projects and whether we're collecting information to do that. And then questions around our ability to effectively manage documentation, no matter what that documentation would be. Okay. My point about technological changes is that over time, new technologies come online and they get used by staff. And they add another type of technology with another type of database that it's being saved in that we didn't have a single repository for documentation, no matter what the purpose of the documentation was, whether it be the original approval note that went up that is a simple Word document, or whether it be an Excel spreadsheet or something along those lines.
Sorry to jump in, but I mean, I think all of these things are problems, right? Like you didn't have a single repository,
that's right.
But you also weren't collecting the right information, and none of these problems would have been solved if there hadn't been technological change. It seems to me if after months of requesting information, the Auditor General still received incomplete information, in many cases, that information of the 50 projects information existed for. Yeah, the information was there, but it took a long time to get it and clearly wasn't being accessed on a regular basis. But for the other projects, it just didn't exist, right? So like, I wanted to come back to my previous question, and we ran out of time on it. You have continued to assert that you know that the work of the government in this area has made a difference in terms of outcomes. The Auditor General has said that you have no data to support that claim. And so how do you sustain that claim in light of the fact the Auditor General says you don't have the data that would justify making that claim?
Thank you for that question. That's actually very good. I will not speak for the Auditor General. What the Auditor General looked at was something that we've called the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistant Policy KPIs, so key performance indicators. These were a set of 26 indicators that were created at the program or corporate level, i.e. they were not associated with a specific project. Instead, they were a set of indicators designed to help us with the implementation of the policy. So, as noted, about $3.5 billion in annual spending. When the new policy was put in place, the government had already been working under a completely different policy in terms of where Canada's development assistance was being focused. The 26 indicators, which, as the Auditor General rightly points out, were fundamentally about performance of or outputs, i.e. what it is that the project money is doing, as opposed to outcomes. It's exactly right. At this corporate level of reporting. The purpose of those indicators was to demonstrate to the government and to Canadians that the department was following the policy, was readjusting the allocations that we were making.
Okay, sorry, I am almost out of time, so we will have to pick this up. But why was the policy designed to measure outputs instead of outcomes? And how was that supposed to be satisfactory to policymakers or to Canadians?
So the policy is a different document from the placemat of indicators that were developed after the policy. So the indicators that were developed were about ensuring that we were turning the boat. As everybody can understand, when you have...
Sorry, yep. You have two different sets of indicators, you're telling me. You have the outcome and the output indicators. The Auditor General was looking at the output indicators. You're now suggesting that you have outcome indicators somewhere, but that information wasn't provided to the Auditor General, or where is this outcome-based data if it wasn't referred to in the Auditor General's report?
Okay, so the outcome-based data is included in each and every one of the individual projects that the department undertakes on an annual basis. There are, on average, it varies from one year to the next, 1,500 individual projects at any one time. Every single one of these projects is required to have a results framework that includes both outcomes and outputs.
Okay, so you're saying the projects
I can explain, if you want me to explain where the difficulty really is, and we do have real difficulties.
Actually, gentlemen, we're going to have to come back to this.
Okay,
the time is up.
Okay, I had asked some questions earlier about outputs versus outcomes, and I wanted to just bring the Auditor General in on it. It's been a few minutes that have elapsed since my previous rounds, but I was referencing you a few times, and I wanted Madam Auditor General just at a broad level, do you think the government has the evidence to support the claims they're making when they say this is making a difference for women and girls around the world?
Well, I think at a broad level, that's exactly what we said in the report, is that they couldn't show us at a broad level. I do acknowledge that at a project level, they can track. And I do think that we should acknowledge, for the example that I gave of building washrooms, is that putting washrooms and hand washing stations in schools is of value to the students in that school. But when the goal was to increase attendance at school, then that's what you should also measure, right? So there is some value, but the ultimate goal is really the one that needs to be measured.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that, if you're spending large amounts of money, government's saying, well, something was done with that money, and it seems to under particular circumstances be making someone's life better. But that is important in a certain sense. But the larger point is, are we getting value for money and having the broadest, greatest impact that we can? And are we tracking to make sure the measures are working to achieve the outcomes we've established that we want to have? And I guess also for the Auditor General, the government says that they have outcome-based data. They're just not maybe consistent in the indicators they're using. Did you see outcome-based data at the project level, or is your impression that they don't have that data at the project level?
So I turned over to just look at those who would have done a lot of the detailed file review, and I would say that at times we did see outcome-based data, but again, it is about, not every, like my bathroom project is one where we wouldn't have.
Right.
So it ultimately, when you're spending $3.5 billion, accounting for it at the $1 million tranches is difficult. You need to have a global picture to even decide whether or not you should reallocate funds to a certain area
Right.
of the world, right? So that information is needed in order to have well-informed decision-making about investments.
So in terms of the existence of outcome-based data at the local level, you're saying it was there. You said there were cases where it was there, but it sounds like the implication is that there were also cases where there was not outcome-based data. So of the projects you looked at, 50 projects, in how many cases was there identifiable outcome-based data at the local level?
I'm going to have to
Happy for others
turn
to
to
chime
someone
in from your
else to
office,
see
yeah.
if they have that sort of level of detail, or do we have to get back to them?
We'd have to get back to you on that. We can say that around half of the projects were reporting against the corporate indicators. And as the department's been saying, all the projects are required to do logic models and identify ultimate outcomes. And as also has been pointed out, because we're fairly early on in the projects being implemented, many of them hadn't completed their work, so it wasn't time
Right.
to report on outcomes. We didn't see serious problems with the way that those tools were created that were being implemented at the project level. Where we were seeing the disconnect was that what the projects were trying to do wasn't translating into corporate indicators.
Right. But if there aren't local outcomes in about half of the cases, then I think the best the government can say is that that some of the projects are doing some good, and for some of the projects we don't know. But I would appreciate just a written follow-up if there are things you haven't had a chance to say, and certainly with some of those, with a breakdown of which projects for which projects was there outcome-based data available in some form, and for which projects was there not.
Thank you. Are you able to provide that?
Oh, well, look into it, and if we don't have anything further to add, we'll let you know either way.
Okay.